Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 147. This week the questions are taken from guide 206 on the L-20E Alpha class that was never built for the Imperial German Navy, and the Salvage of Pearl Harbour video part 2, which seems to have proven very popular. Samuel Green asks, how much influence does one nation's shipbuilding have on another's? I know you mentioned this a little in this video, and that's the L-20E Alpha one, but are there major examples of a ship being built and a nation going, we need to do that, but bigger? The influence is usually quite considerable, but it comes in, I'd say, probably about 3 tiers. So on the first tier, you have navies that genuinely cannot afford in any way, shape or form to keep up with much of anyone, but they need something to at least be somewhere in the ballpark. So that would be, for example, the Spanish Navy in the Dreadnought era. There is no way Spain is keeping up with any of the major or second-tier powers naval-wise, but for national pride and for the sake of having a modern navy, they need something. And so you get the España class. If the Dreadnoughts hadn't come about, the Españas wouldn't have come about, I'm pretty sure. So that's a degree of influence, but it's not a huge amount other than we are ordering a ship that has kind of the same caliber weaponry. Now, the next tier of influence is the more general tier of other nations roughly on the same level as us are building ships with this kind of size or this kind of firepower or whatever, and we need to vaguely match it because that's the latest and greatest technology, obviously, because other people have now built this thing. So that would be for nations that aren't necessarily directly competitive, i.e. they're not looking at potentially going to war with each other anytime soon, but they all want to be seen as having the best. So you might look at, say, Japan in the run-up to World War I. It's not planning on going to war with Britain, but they still have things like the Congos built, reflecting the latest and greatest, as far as they are concerned, battle cruiser designs. And 14-inch guns, because, well, someone managed to actually sell a 14-inch gun after all their various efforts. But, yes, so there's lots of comparisons drawn between Tiger and Congo. The ones where they say, this one is just a copy of the other, are pretty inaccurate, but they both come from a similar design lineage. So if, for example, the Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary and Tiger hadn't been built, then I'm fairly sure that the Japanese would have gone with one of the earlier design studies for the Congos that had a lot of 12-inch guns instead of the 14s. So if you had the Germans building Von der Tann and Moltke and Seydlitz, etc., and the British obviously building Invincible and Indefatigable in their classes, if the British had then continued with a 10-gun all-centre-line 12-inch battlecruiser, the Japanese probably would have followed suit. But they didn't. The British went to 13.5, and so the Japanese thought going to 14 was a good idea, even though they had no particular plans of going to war with Britain, because, they're allied with Britain. And then finally, you have the direct competitors. So when you have direct competitors where there is a possibility, maybe slightly remote, possibly very, very close, of going to war with somebody, that's when the influence starts to gather a pace quite considerably. Now, that can be mitigated by the idea of following a slightly different strategic line. So if you look at the development of the High Seas Fleet and the Royal Navy in the run-up to World War I, they're quite obviously competing with each other, but you can see that the Germans are following a slightly different design path to the British, and despite going into Jutland with the British having 12-inch gunships, 13.5-inch gunships and 15-inch gunships, now admittedly the Germans are in the process of commissioning Bayern and Baden, but the actual High Seas Fleet at Jutland is entirely 11-inch and 12-inch gunships, which until the advent of the Queen Elizabeth's near enough were considered fine, despite the 13.5-inch gun armament on British ships. However, once that battle was over, that situation changed. You had the results of Jutland, and one of the takeaways on the German side, driven quite heavily by Admiral Scheer, was we need bigger guns. So you suddenly went from planning for 13-point-something-inch caliber guns on German battle cruisers and continuations of the Bayern and Baden's 15-inch, i.e. roughly pacing British development, albeit a couple of years later, to suddenly the L-20E Alphas looking at 16.5-inch guns, the battle cruisers now going up to 15-inch guns, basically trying to overdo the British with gun caliber. And if you cycle a few decades down the line to the Kriegsmarine build-up, you've got the Panzerschiff, which are obviously designed for meandering around doing commerce raiding and such like. But then, at that point, they're designed mostly for potential war with France. France takes one look at them. They build the Dunkirk and Strasbourg to counter them. The Germans look at Dunkirk and Strasbourg and build the Scharnhorst to counter them. The French then modify Strasbourg slightly mid-build to take account of the Scharnhorsts, and then you have the Richelieus, and then you have the Bismarcks, and that is a very, very close example of, he has built something slightly bigger and more powerful. We must therefore build something even bigger and more powerful than that, and so on and so forth, all the way up the tree. BK Zhong asks, how comparable are the late World War I capital ship designs such as Hood, the L-20E Alphas, and the Mackensens, etc., compared to World War II era fast big gun capital ships? As built, obviously they're not going to be that competitive, but if you consider them as if they were built and then refitted or modernised in some manner, possibly as advanced as the Italian or British modernisations of the Dorias or the Cavors or Queen Elizabeth and Valiant or Renown, or possibly only somewhat modernised, they actually generally would be fairly competitive. Now, that varies from ship to ship. So the main things that would need updating between the two, first thing, fire control. One of the things that Hood really had going against it in World War II was the fact, although she had a cutting-edge fire control suite for 1919, it really, really wasn't by, 1939. So... but those kinds of things are relatively easy to refit. So if you're looking at speed, protection, and firepower, the traditional trinity of capital ship design, when you look at those three designs, for example, Mackensen, L-20E Alpha, and Hood, speed-wise, Hood's definitely got it. L-20E Alpha and Mackensen are perhaps a little bit slow compared to what you'd want them to be for World War II. You've got the treaty battleship, so if you can bump L-20E Alpha up a couple of knots to just over 28 knots, and if you can bump Mackensen up from 28 knots to just over 30, which is kind of what the Japanese did with the Congos, then their speed are completely acceptable. I wouldn't necessarily want to take a Mackensen as a 28-knotter against a treaty battleship, though. So that's why you need the extra speed, so it can be used as a battlecruiser still. However, with that said, these ships are built again at the end or designed at the end of World War I, so given the advances in technology with small tube boilers, more efficient power plants, higher pressure machinery, etc., again, if they had been refitted or modernised in the 30s and given these new power plants, well, Hood could have kept her speed and had a bunch of other modifications done, and I think it's entirely plausible to say the L-20E Alphas or the Mackensens could have both been bumped up by a couple of knots. And the Japanese did a bit better than that with the Congos, albeit without too many other upgrades as a result. But it certainly could be done, albeit that it does limit the number of, as I say, other upgrades you might be able to do. When it comes to protection, again, the protection's not bad. In part, that's because of the holdover, so many holdover World War I warships anyway. But compared to the World War II era fast big gun capital ships, L-20E Alpha's overall belt thickness is not bad. Mackensen and Hood, well, Hood's got the 12-inch angled armour, so it's not too bad at maximum thickness, it's just not distributed widely enough. Mackensen has a similar level of armour protection, and, well, the main thing is that all of those designs are World War I era, so they're distributed armour scheme. Now, redesigning that to be a all-or-nothing style armour scheme, and that's before we look into like deck armour and everything, that's going to be harder, but as some of the sketches for Hood's refit show, it can be done. So, saving weight by deleting extraneous thinner plate and then bulking up on the main thickness of plate, that can definitely be done. Increasing the maximum thickness of the main belt is a somewhat more difficult issue, not only because it obviously incurs more weight penalties, but because you're physically adding slightly to the width of the ship and you're having to take off the actual main belt armour, which all increases price and cost. But, I mean, 12-inch slab-sided armour on the Mackensens is probably pushing it a little, but there still are capital ships out there in the time period of World War II that have a roughly equivalent or worse armour. But if we're looking specifically at the treaty-era ships, you probably would need to, on Hood and Mackensen at least, to beef that up somewhat. But again, could be done. The last bit is firepower. Obviously, these ships don't have brilliant AA. That would need to be retrofitted, probably by just, stripping out all the old secondaries and putting on dual-purpose AA mounts. That would work fine. The guns, L-20E Alpha and Hood with superchargers and increased elevation, L-20E Alpha with perhaps just a new set of shells, would be competitive. The Mackensens, possibly not, because it's just such a smaller calibre, unless you're looking at a direct comparison with something like the Dunkirks, in which case they might be in the ballpark. So there is plenty that can be upgraded within the scope of a regular modernisation in order to make them capable and competitive with treaty-era ships, especially for Hood and L-20E Alpha. I'm not quite so certain about the Mackensens, but it does require that modernisation. Just putting new fire control on is going to leave them with some fairly big weaknesses in terms of overall efficiency of their armour layout and speed in everything except Hood's case compared to a treaty-era warship. So potential is there, but it's going to require a QE or Doria or Cavour style modernisation. Calvin Green 90 asks, if a patriotic young German draftsman had hidden a good set of drawings for the L-20E Alpha under his bed at the end of World War I and brought them out for modernising in time for Bismarck to be considered, would Bismarck have been a better battleship, or would the modernised L-20E Alpha have been a better choice? That's a very good question, especially considering the previous one. It could be competitive if it was heavily modernised as a design, but there are probably going to be some issues, so let's take a quick look through. Armour, L-20E Alpha actually has thicker belt armour than Bismarck, so that's a plus in for it, but the deck generally is thinner. It does have a comparably thick armour deck to Bismarck in some areas, but not as widely spread, so you would have to increase the deck armour, which is going to add a significant amount of weight to the ship. On the other hand, there is quite a lot of armour, almost 7 inches of armour on L-20E Alpha's casemates, so if you're deleting the casemates and the casemate guns in exchange for deck-mounted guns, that might save some or possibly all the weight that you need to upgrade the deck. I don't necessarily think it will save all of it, but certainly save a reasonable amount of it. Then everything else is broadly comparable armour-wise. Torpedo protection is going to be rather different, because the L-20E Alphas, obviously, they're going to be equipped with a late World War I torpedo defence system as opposed to Bismarck, so that potentially is going to be a somewhat thing of an issue. Speed, as we discussed in the previous questions, 26 knots versus just over 30 for Bismarck. It's possible that introducing the new power plant for Bismarck would address that and would get L-20E Alpha up to speed. However, asking it to do 4 or 5 knots more than originally designed for, that's probably going to require some changes to the hull form. That may even require the ship to be slightly lengthened, but that's going to depend on a lot more hydrodynamic modelling, which they'd have to do. And it's not that far off Bismarck's length to begin with, so maybe speed-wise it certainly could very, very easily get it up to 28 knots, I think, on the existing hull with modern propulsion, but asking it to do Bismarck's top speed might be pushing your luck somewhat. Armament-wise, obviously it's got 16.5-inch guns versus 15-inch guns. The 16.5-inch guns therefore going to have a bigger shell, heavier shell. The flip side is they're 45 caliber. They're not going to be as high velocity as Bismarck's 15-inch guns. So that's probably going to be something of a trade-off. More destructive power per shell hit from the L-20E Alpha design compared to somewhat better armour penetration from the Bismarck. So overall, I think you could probably get a slightly slower, slightly better protected ship, and then the armament is kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another, depending on what particular kind of projectile and what projectile performance you actually want out of it. Merriman Devonshire asks, a bit of an esoteric question you may have already answered, but how did the various naval groups, military and commercial, around the world agree upon the international signal flags that we have today? Basically, you can thank the British Empire, and literally that is how it came about. In the middle of the 19th century, and to be honest, for a considerable period thereafter, pretty much every navy had its own signal flags and the meanings thereof. Every nation had some slightly different codes for how their merchant ships would signal to each other. There were a few agreed upon standards, but they were very limited. And then the British turned around and said, right, here is a block of signal flags. Here's their meaning. Here's a broadly international set of signals, and we want everyone to use them. They couldn't technically enforce that on everyone, obviously, and they did still have a separate section which was for British ships only. But in the middle of the 19th century, and then for about the next 50 plus years thereafter, Britain had the world's largest navy, and Britain also controlled the single largest merchant fleet on the planet. So everywhere you went, you would be seeing flags, signal flags to this new code that they'd proposed. And if you were a foreign ship and you wanted to travel to or from Britain or a British colony, and there were a lot of them, then you'd be expected to use that code. And if you were communicating with a British ship, well, you can kind of see the point. By this point, simply by tyranny of numbers, people started adopting it, and gradually over time it just filtered into, okay, well, this is the international default. It went through a number of revisions thereafter as everyone kind of got on board with it and started making suggestions, but the initial origins of how we get to the international flag and pennant code that we have these days is literally the British going, we want one, and we have the numbers to just kind of enforce it by, we have more ships than you do, so you're going to have to learn it. It's kind of the same way English has become the universal language. English-speaking people were just everywhere, so you might as well learn it. Paul Pomikala asks, would it be too much trouble to add a calendar or list showing the dates of refloating, entering dry dock and departure for the west coast of the various battleships at Pearl Harbour? Well, there you go. Just a quick guide. Obviously, red is indicative of sunk and no particular work being done. Orange is the ship was damaged, was never actually sunk. Yellow is salvage efforts underway. Blue, where applicable, is in dry dock - afloat in Pearl Harbour itself. And then green is on its way to the west coast. Now, my spreadsheet program doesn't allow me to do two-colour gradient for specific months, so I've indicated where the date of a changeover in state is, and where possible I've done it so that if the majority of time during a particular month was spent doing one thing, that is the colour that that month has, with the exception of the leave dates, obviously, because it's leaving in that month. Doesn't really matter exactly when. So you can see, for example, all the salvaging work starts on most of the ships on the 14th of December 1941, but there's no major work done to Oklahoma until the 16th of July 42, whereas all the other ships that are sunk, with obviously the other exception being Arizona, they have salvage work starting on the 14th, and then you can see the various dates when they are raised and put into dry docks, and then you can see the time they spend in either dry docks or fitting out yards in Pearl Harbor, and then when they head off. And then you've got the 3 battleships that were just damaged, and they actually all left together towards the end of December 1941 for the west coast. Smiling Cat asks, how common and dangerous was the problem of hydrogen sulfide building up in damaged ships? I recall reading USS Marblehead also lost 2 crewmen to similar gas build-up long after she'd been patched up and was on her way back to the US for proper repairs. Did they have a means of detecting it, or was it a case of ventilating the ship and pulling people out of the area if they started showing symptoms? Hydrogen sulfide buildup was a problem anywhere that you had organic material of some description rotting away in a low, limited or no oxygen environment, like, say, flooded areas. And, of course, if that was sealed away by bulkheads or other flooding, it could diffuse into the water and then be released when exposed to air, or it might just build up in air pockets and such like. They did have means of detecting it, although during the Pearl Harbor salvage they had to borrow hydrogen sulfide indicators from onshore installations, so I don't necessarily think that a lot of ships would have just been carrying hydrogen sulfide indicators at random. In most cases, if hydrogen sulfide was detected, the best way of getting rid of it was pulling people out of the area and then very, very carefully trying to ventilate the place. The main problem when you're talking about salvage work, or possibly in Marblehead's case, I don't know the exact details of it, that particular incident, but definitely with Pearl Harbor, of people working on the salvage efforts, is that because it could end up in the water and then come out of the water as you opened up the area, you could suddenly get a very rapid rise in hydrogen sulfide, and it's not just a case like carbon dioxide poisoning of you don't have any oxygen. It is actively toxic, so in high enough concentrations it will just kill you stone cold dead before you can get anywhere safe. So it's not so much a case of symptoms, because hydrogen sulfide smells quite bad. If someone can sort of smell that really horrible smell and is feeling nauseous or whatever, they can usually get out, or someone will tell them to get out. The main problem is when you get a sudden burst of it in high concentrations, and then that just gets rid of you before you can really respond. Galdir Ioni asks, how bad was the environmental damage caused by the attack, and how much effort was later invested into clearing that up? Because I figure having a layer of toxic sludge at the bottom of your harbour, releasing who knows what every time it's disturbed, might have a detrimental effect on fishing and so on in the region. I didn't read too extensively into a kind of environmental impact assessment, such as there even was one in the 1940s, but generally speaking, most of the toxic and nasty stuff from the ships wouldn't tend to stick around at the bottom. That's because, you think the oil from the burst tanks, that tends to float to the surface, and indeed Arizona is still slowly leaking oil. So because it was the fuel was so valuable, and also it was just an absolute mess. No one liked having it around on the surface. That did get corralled, not immediately, but over the course of the first few months. Most of the oil leaks and slicks were corralled and pumped away, and where possible salvaged. As for the other stuff, mostly the bioorganic residue, that again, for the most part, floated when it was free of the ships. And whilst it's not exactly pleasant, considering that the most optimistic you could hope for the bioorganic sludge you got out of the ships was that hopefully it was the ship's pantry that had gone bad, to say less about everything else. But most of that really bad stuff, when it was pumped out of the ships, was pumped into sort of tankers and boats and stuff and taken away for disposal. Apart from anything else, all the people working around the ship and in the harbour didn't want that stuff just floating around them or washing up against them. Sometimes it was just discharged into the harbour, mostly when it would be caught up in the general pumping efforts. If they were just trying to pump out what was mostly water, some stuff might come with it. But with it being biological, the local fish population would have finished off most of that. So there would actually be a surprisingly small amount of heavier than water toxic pollutants that would be around for any particular length of time. There'd be fragments of the ship and things like that on the ocean floor, but that's not especially toxic in the grand scheme of things. Grand Admiral Zarin asks, would you do something like the Pearl Harbour salvage videos for the Italian salvage after the Taranto raid by the British? Well, I'd have to, do a video on Taranto itself first, but yes, once I've done a video on Taranto, I have no objection to doing a follow-up video on the salvage around Taranto. And I think through this year, going into next and onwards, I think this perhaps will become something of a pattern where applicable to the Wednesday videos on the channel. As you may have noticed, I am doing, roughly speaking, about once a month a Guadalcanal battle video, so that will, in maybe another 2-3 months, have wrapped up the various naval battles around Guadalcanal. And so that's kind of forming an ongoing series. Then over the summer, I'm hoping to wrap up some of the outstanding series, such as Nelson and destroyers and aircraft carrier development, etc. And then, as I said before, going into the autumn, I'm hoping to start an Anglo-Dutch war series, which will kind of follow roughly the same pace as the Guadalcanal series has. But I think, where you've got linked videos, where it might be far too much to try and put it all into one, so like with Taranto, the attack and the salvage, then these sort of 2, maybe 3 episode mini-series style things where you cover one element, which is maybe the main element that everyone's heard of, and then you follow it up with another major element that perhaps people haven't heard of so much. So Taranto and then its salvage would be a good one. For something like, say, the Italian attack on Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, the attack and the salvage are kind of linked, so that would probably all be one video. So sometimes where it's relevant and important, the salvage will be in the video itself, and in other times when it can form a standalone video because it's on a fairly large scale, like at Taranto, then it will be in its own separate one. Stavka asks, how much electric power redundancy would a battleship have in its design phase, and what are the major considerations when designing this? Again, as with so many things, varies depending on the navy and on the time period. Very early battleships, as in like 19th century, it could quite often simply be a case of has electricity, and if you manage to break something particularly important, does not have electricity. But that would be more back when you talk about electricity basically just being the lighting and things like that. As you progress into the 20th century and electrical power becomes more and more important for lighting still, radios, ventilation, refrigeration, in some cases power training for the guns and so forth, and running all sorts of various bits and pieces, then you start to see more and more redundancy come in. So there are two major considerations when it comes to power distribution aboard a ship and surviving battle damage. The first one is your actual electrical grid. How interconnected is it? How many redundancies and backups are built into it? Because it's all very well having, 50 different systems all run by electricity, but if each of them are run off their own distinct circuit, then when that circuit gets broken for whatever reason, that system is dead until you do physical repairs. Whereas if you have an integrated electrical grid with many different circuits that can potentially be bypassed or rerouted at the flick of a switch or a relay to still provide power from source to end use, even if sections of the grid are damaged, then you can take a fair bit of battle damage and actually still have good chunks of your electrical system online. I mean, there's a potential that a lot of damage might sever all possible electrical connections to a part of the ship, which would then render it powerless from an electrical standpoint. But a single shell hit, in theory, shouldn't disrupt end-to-end power on a battleship, even if it might disrupt the specific systems it actually physically destroys. Your problem with that is, of course, that if you have a given amount of electrical power running through the grid and you start losing sections of it and some of that power is now being rerouted through other sections, those sections have to be able to take this additional load. And if they are unable to take that load, then they're going to burn out. And so to prevent them burning out, that's why you have breakers. And that's why I've got South Dakota starring as the image for this particular question, because she did have a fairly redundant electrical power grid, but she also had these safety breakers built in to make sure she didn't overload the remaining parts of her grid when bits of it went offline, and it was effectively disabling some of those breakers by refusing to let them, snap open. That resulted in most of the more critical power failures that she experienced during the night action of Guadalcanal. So that's one thing. How redundant is your grid, and what safety procedures have you got in to stop that redundancy in and of itself causing problems? The second bit is, where are you getting the power from? Do you have reserve power? Because it's no good, for example, having, say, 2 generators or dynamos or some other form of electrical power that provide, say, 110% of your electrical needs, because then if you lose one, you now only have 55% of your electrical needs, which means suddenly vast amounts of your electrical systems have to start shutting down because there just isn't the power to run them anymore. So ideally, you want to have electrical generation capacity that is well in excess of what you think you're actually going to need during battle. The flip side is that if you have, 24 generators, that's going to take up a lot of room, and bearing in mind a lot of the time these independent generators are using fuel, their own fuel. Quite often they're diesel generators, sometimes they're petrol, sometimes they have dynamos hooked up to the turbines or whatever. But let's say we're using standalone diesel generators, which are quite common during a good chunk of the classic period of dreadnought battleships. Then if you've got, as you say, your 24 diesel generators, that's a lot of diesel fuel you've got to carry. There's a lot of space you've got to put aside for them. That's a lot of wiring you've got to do to link them all up. And you may only ever use 2 or 3 of them. So that could be wasted space. Whereas, obviously, you don't want to, if you only need 2 or 3 of them, to just have 3. So you've got to strike a balance somewhere. Do we have a case of, well, we need 2 generators, so we're going to have 4. Well, we need 3, so we'll have 6. Or do we need 3, so we're going to have 9. This is one of the bigger considerations. And also what size of generators, because they're not all going to be the same. So you might have, say, a primary generator and a few backups, but the backups might be smaller. Or you might have a big backup generator and a number of smaller ones doing your regular generating capability, and permutations thereof. So those are your 2 biggest considerations when it comes to how much electrical power redundancy you're going to have, because it doesn't matter how redundant your electrical grid is if your one electrical source gets taken out, and likewise it doesn't matter if you've got 24 electrical sources if each of your electrical systems only has a single circuit. And whilst some ships are better than others, you've also got to remember that for the vast majority of ships, the amount of electric power redundancy they have decreases over time, because even in World War One they're getting more radio fits, and in World War Two they're getting more and different and more power intensive radars. They're getting new radio sets. There's basically more electrical systems being added to the ship, which is obviously going to have an increase draw on the electrical system. And you may get an additional generator or two in a refit, but you may not. So a ship that might have plenty of reserve power when it's launched in, 1938, by 1944 it might be scraping around for every stray erg of energy that it can find. Dylan von Antwerp asks, if the US Navy had decided to, as a matter of national pride, return Oklahoma and Arizona to service, how would they have gone about it in the latter's case? Was it even physically possible to refloat the ship? And if the ships had returned to service, would they have received similar rebuilds to their sister ships, or complete reconstruction along the lines of West Virginia, California, and Tennessee? In Oklahoma's case, it would have been physically possible. They did get her refloated after all. It was just judged economically infeasible, and she was a much older ship anyway, and there just wasn't the drive to do so. But if, as a matter of pride, as you say, they decide, you know what, we are just going to do it anyway, it would have had to have been a full rebuild. That ship spent so long underwater, plus it was upside down, plus it was hit by stupid numbers of torpedoes, and as a result was so completely trashed that there is no way you could have pulled off a Nevada style apparently, refit of her. You would have almost, not quite, but almost had to have taken her apart and put her back together again, at which point you might as well, considering the stupid amount of expense you're going through at this point, do a complete West Virginia style rebuild on her. I mean, it's not going to be a most really spectacularly useful ship at the end of it, but at least it'll probably do decently in shore bombardment and probably some anti-aircraft work. In terms of Arizona, honestly, I do not think you're getting that ship back. I mean, the forward part of the ship is basically gone as far as, the whole being a ship part is concerned. So at best, you'd be trying somehow to cut the thing in half, and that doesn't really lend itself well to refloating. So unless they did something truly monumental, like, as I say, somehow managing to cut the ship in half whilst underwater, bringing in a big floating dry dock, maybe resting it on the seabed behind her, hauling her up with a mixture of flotation, pump work, and chains, just enough to get her into the floating dry dock, and then bring her up and presumably do further work there. I mean, the shockwave of that magazine explosion will have wrecked so much internally, even further back in Arizona, and collapsed so much that I don't even think taking the back half or back third or whatever, and then trying to rebuild the front in some kind of slightly macabre Ship of Theseus program would have been in any way reasonably possible. I mean, you'd start to enter territory of, one, it would simply be cheaper to build a replica of Arizona at that point, and two, you pretty much would be building a replica of Arizona at that point, because there would be sub 50% of the original ship actually involved. I think, yeah, if you were... I can't see it being practical or possible to do that with Arizona. About the best you could probably hope for as a sort of balance between, we want to bring something we could technically call Arizona back into service as a matter of national pride with a semi-unlimited budget, and the simple physical status of the ship's wreck would maybe be to, as they actually did, salvage the guns and maybe salvage portions of the ship's material and then use that material in the construction of new plating for a new ship which you call Arizona, and then maybe stick its guns back on it. So you can say, well, this is Arizona's guns, the ship, this new Arizona 2 or Arizona B, if you want to go with the Star Trek theme, is somewhat made of the old Arizona, kind of like how USS New York these days has elements of the Twin Towers in her. Again, material, not actual structural beams or something they pulled out of the wreckage. And in the same vein, Sovereign of the Seas donated parts of herself to the later Royal Sovereign, and possibly the one after that, somewhat speculatively. So that would be pretty much the only way I could see anything that you could even vaguely call Arizona coming back into service in the form of a battleship. Octavia asks, I've read there was a near mutiny on Macassar over her officers' attempts to bulk up the sailors on a European diet, and to this day submarines have a maximum height. How often does a nation's physical average affect naval construction? Have shorter populations ever resulted in shorter decks and therefore armour belts? Not that I'm aware of specifically, for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that ships, if there is a pressing physical design constraint that requires decks to be higher or lower, they'll build the decks higher or lower and the crew will just have to make do with it. And secondly, whilst overall height for most nations has varied over time, the first thing is that variation is still relatively small, usually in the span of maybe 4 to 6 inches, which, is not usually going to make all that much difference in the overall stability of a ship, Vasa being a slight exception to that rule, as discussed in the first video on Vasa. But as you can see in this example, which is the deck of HMS Northumberland, or one of the gun deck, you also have to deal with, how big is your gun, how much space above that gun do you need to be able to manipulate it and reload it, and that's going to put a hard limit on how low you can drop the decks, because if the deck is right down on top of the gun, then that gun becomes almost impossible to manage, which will have its own issues. And then, as you mentioned, submarine services do sometimes have a maximum height. You can't be above a certain height to be aboard a submarine, and that kind of illustrates the point. They're not going to make submarines larger just because perhaps their average population might yield people of a somewhat taller build than others. The operational constraints of the warship are going to make all the difference. And if people are slightly smaller, then they can fit through the submarine or the warship easier. Well, okay, that's great, but there's no real reason to change the entire ship on their behalf. And trust me, if you've ever been through a submarine, you'll know that the hatches are not the easiest of things to get through, even for someone who's relatively small. I'm kind of middle of the pack. I'm 5'11" to 6 foot on a good day. And getting through those submarine hatches, whilst it's entirely possible to do smoothly and efficiently, it does require a little bit of athletics. It's not something that can be done quickly or safely in a hurry unless you have the technique to get through. And then as technology goes on and ships develop, you get things like pipe work, electrical work, overhead lighting fixtures and so forth, and they force an increase in the overall height of the decks anyway. And the final thing, which perhaps many people aren't aware of, is that the average height of people you might find in the Navy throughout most of naval history is a lot closer to the modern average height than you might expect. That's not to say they were of the same average height as today, but a lot of people, when you think about, average height, people in the past must have been shorter, but you get a slightly artificially reduced view, I guess, of the people of the past, especially in the West, based on the Industrial Revolution period, i.e. basically most of the 19th century. And in those days, yes, the average height was a reasonable amount smaller than it is now. But that is actually something of an aberration. If you look at the overall charts of people's average heights for any given country, but obviously I'm more familiar with the Western countries, over time, you'll see that there's variation that generally corresponds to how available nutrition was, which is, there is a direct correlation with that, shockingly enough. And it's actually generally the average height is slightly higher, or in some cases considerably higher, than it was in the 19th century, before the 19th century. Then you get the Industrial Revolution, everyone's being packed into polluted cities for a large part. The city population goes up massively as a proportion of the overall country's population. And you have, as well as the pollutants, you have individually poorer nutrition, both in terms of quality and in terms of quantity. And shockingly enough, the average height of the population decreases. And you see the same kinds of decreases in other times of significant privation in the past. And then it climbs back up again through the early 20th century. And then nowadays we get to the point that we're at now. But say prior to that, and on navy ships, which, bear in mind, okay, they didn't take children as in babes in arms and toddlers aboard, but they did take kids in fairly young. Now, whilst some of those kids' growth might have been stunted already by very early in life lack of nutrition, you were still talking about children going on when they're barely into the double digits, and sometimes not even then, if depending on the child in question. So with the surprising amount of calories that were available in a naval diet, on average, a sailor might be fractionally taller and fractionally, a lot more better built, on average, than the average landsman of the period. At least, again, for the Western navies. Tactical Pants asks, why are engineering rates in the US often called Snipes? I wouldn't say this is 100% confirmed, because I've found a few different places and sources that describe different origins of the term Snipes, including some that say, it was originally an insult aimed at the engineers, although it doesn't go into the etymology of what the insult actually means. But regardless, the majority of versions seem to account that it's possibly related to an engineer named John Snipes, although a couple of them do say, well, we don't strictly know exactly who the engineer was, but naval law has labelled him John Snipes, so we're going to go with that. But effectively, back in the early days of steamships, and obviously engines therefore aboard ships, the engineers were treated very much as kind of second-class sailors and looked down upon and even mistreated by their fellow sailors. And apparently John Snipes was one who didn't really like this, so he turned around and said, no, you are actually going to treat us fairly. We're not going to be at the back end of the queue for food, we're not going to be at the back end of the queue for accommodation, etc., etc. We're going to have the same rights as everybody else on this ship. And everyone went, yeah, that's funny, go back in the hole. At which point Snipes turned around to his crew and said, okay, put the fires out. And of course the steamship came to a grinding halt, and I was like, oh, what's going on? Why can't we go anywhere? At which point Snipes duly reappeared and said words to the effect of, right, well, since you're all stuck here and we're the only ones who can get you going again, how about we rethink this whole treating us fairly aspect of things? And apparently that worked. At least it started the ball rolling on it working. And then it took a while, but eventually US engineering officers got to be treated, somewhat like equals by the rest of the crew. And they became known, because of this incident, as Snipes men, which then got reduced to Snipes, or I guess Snipes singular. Von Hindenburg asks, did Axis and Soviet navies have chaplains or local equivalents aboard, and were their duties similar to those in the Anglosphere fleets? Are there any stories of their heroics on the order of Father O'Callaghan of USS Franklin? In terms of heroics, there may well have been. I imagine there's a fair number of them around who might very well have done something particularly notable when the ship was in danger, but I'm not immediately aware of any of those stories, although if anyone knows of some and wants to jump in, then obviously please feel free to do so in the comments. But as for the Axis navies, well, obviously, yes, the Italians had chaplains aboard. The Kriegsmarine also had chaplains aboard their ships, and the Japanese apparently had Buddhist chaplain equivalents aboard their ships. The sole exception in World War II fleets appears to have been, shockingly enough, the Soviets, because officially the Soviet Union was an atheist state, and therefore there was no role for a religious figure of any description aboard the ship. I suppose technically you could go to the political officer, but that doesn't seem particularly wise to me. Loch Ness Hamster asks, what was the state of the Soviet Navy at the end of World War II, and what were the plans for rebuilding and expansion immediately afterwards? It was, shall we say, something of a confused mess. The Soviets had fairly significant plans for a surface fleet. Large destroyers, powerful cruisers, and also slightly less powerful but numerous cruisers, battleships, etc., and constant dalliances back and forth with maybe building an aircraft carrier before the war. The war had kind of ruined most of those plans. None of the capital ships that had been laid down would ever be completed. A number of cruisers had been damaged or destroyed on the stocks. Others were still there awaiting completion, but obviously their designs were now somewhat obsolete. A lot of the Soviet Navy's surface fleet that had existed at the start of the war didn't exist by the end of the war, and a lot of what was left was also completely and hopelessly obsolete. The one area where the Soviet Navy had grown quite considerably during the war, both in terms of size and capability, was their submarine arm. That had become quite an interesting phenomena, and something that would continue into the Cold War. So, yeah, there were some, should we say, some issues with the Red Navy at the end of World War II. However, there were a lot of plans for rebuilding, starting off with revised designs for ships that had been under construction and were still present on the stocks, either intact at whatever stage of development they'd been paused at, or repairable if they'd been damaged. So some of the Chapayev class cruisers, for instance. Then for some of the what had been newer ships before the war, there was the potential of a refit to bring them up to spec, and then there was taking all the various war lessons and building new ships from that. So things like the Sverdlov class cruisers, for instance. And then, of course, Stalin also had a lot of plans for building up the fleet even larger. Lots of big surface capital units, both aircraft carriers and battleships, as well as some battle cruisers. But all of those plans were laid down, some of those ships were started, and then Stalin rather inconsiderately died. And in the massive power struggle that ensued and the massive change in direction to the Soviet war machine, a lot of those plans died off again, and the whole thing had to be redeveloped again. And then you start to see the Soviet Cold War era fleet developing out of that. The one thing that kind of maintained a steady and onward progress and growth throughout World War II and then into the Cold War was the Russian submarine fleet. Edward Franklin Woods asks, how much of a sailor's watch was made up of busy work, or was most of it necessary to keep the ship from losing the fight against the sea? It depended an awful lot on the circumstances and the time that you're talking about. So on wooden ships, for example, especially during wartime, there would not be a tremendous amount of busy work, because wooden ships require a lot more ongoing care and maintenance and repair whilst they're underway, especially obviously the sail-powered ones, than, say, an iron or steel contemporary would do. And so whether a sailor was cleaning and polishing the decks to make sure that algae didn't develop and make them all slippery, or repitching or recorking between the timbers to make sure there weren't leaks, or repairing sails, repairing ropes, checking the guns, etc. All of these kind of things needed to be done on a near constant basis, and so especially during wartime, the amount of busy work that would be present on an Age of Sail ship of the line would be fairly minimal. During peacetime, when some of those things like ongoing damage, etc., weren't so much of a concern or weren't happening because they weren't being shot at, then there could be a certain amount of busy work that would come in. But at that stage, it would depend a lot more on the captain. Some captains would just set their men to idle busy work. Some would just grant them liberty to do things like fish over the side. Others would try and improve their men's lot in life by organising education, trying to teach them to read and write if they didn't know how, or teach them other things that might be considered kind of a basic schooling these days, in order to, say, benefit their crews overall. And this was the kind of degree of freedom that you could have on an Age of Sail vessel, whether it be a ship of the line or a frigate or whatever. Now, as ships went over more and more to iron and steel, which are somewhat more durable and need, I wouldn't say, no, they don't need no maintenance, but they certainly need less ongoing maintenance once you've taken the sails out of the equation, as compared to an Age of Sail ship of the line. Although there's new kinds of maintenance, like all the engineering plant that needs to be done, then you start to see an uptick in busy work a lot of the time. Again, not so much during wartime, because there's always something interesting to do for a ship at war during wartime, but during the extended periods of peace that quite often characterise the major navies of the 19th century, busy work did increase more and more and more and more, to some fairly ridiculous degrees. I mean, you look at the amount of paint that accumulated on some Royal Navy ships in the latter part of the 19th century. There was absolutely no need to do any of that. It was just a sop to the captain's desire to have his ship the most spick and span vessel in the fleet. But, it was therefore work he decided needed to be done, but it was, by any reasonable definition of the phrase, busy work. And then as you get into the 20th century, ships are obviously becoming more and more complex still, and therefore there's more things to break, more things to maintain, and so on and so forth. And so you see a degree of lessening in busy work and more practical work being done in the 20th century, but that's also combined with a little bit more freedom for sailors, as well as more wide an interesting variety of things to do on the ship. So as you get into the World War II period and beyond, there can be some busy work, but maybe not quite as much as there was before. Iconoclast asks, looking at the book's Anatomy of the Ship for Warspite and Hood, I was surprised to see armour on wooden backing at this late period. I thought this was a distinctive mark of ships described as ironclads, so in what ways were these later battleships not ironclads, and when, and especially why, did the practice of using wood in significant quantities in warship construction disappear? So, wooden backing effectively remained in practice all the way through to pretty much the end of battleship construction. The reason why they're not ironclads per se, well, one, they're not clad in iron, they're using steel, if you want to be really pedantic, but the other thing is, I think more of what you're getting at is, why are they held as having a different kind of armour scheme when they still seem to be some form of composite, is that whilst in, say, HMS Warrior, where you've got 4.5 inches of iron and then many, 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 many inches of teak, the teak backing in the case of dreadnoughts and fast battleships and such is not there primarily as any form of actual armour protection. It's not meant to offer any kind of resistance to the incoming shell or shot or whatever it happens to be thrown at it, which to a certain degree the teak backing for the older ironclads was supposed to do, which is one of the reasons why it was so thick compared to the thickness of the armour plate. Whereas by the time you get to the 20th century, not only has the teak backing decreased massively as an overall proportion of thickness, it's now much thinner than the armour plate that it's sitting behind rather than being much thicker, but it's also decreased in absolute thickness. It's no longer sort of 18 inches thick, it's maybe 2-3 inches thick, if that. And you can see here there's some teak on HMS Tiger. So the reason for maintaining the teak is largely twofold. One is somewhat more important than the other. A small part of it is shock absorption. Basically, if you've got wood backing the armour plate, then some of the initial shock from the impact of the armour will go into the teak and be distributed through the teak. And yes, it'll probably do a fair bit of damage to the teak, but wood is, under those kind of circumstances, somewhat compressible. So it slightly reduces the chances of starting bolts and rivets and such just from the shock. But perhaps much more importantly, even if armour resists the incoming shell relatively well, there's still a lot of force that's going to be transmitted through that armour plate, and that can lead to spalling. And spalling is where bits of the interior of the armour plate will break off and go pinging around places. That can cause damage, it can injure people, it can potentially even start small fires if the impact energy has generated enough heat in the armor plate to make the fragments that fly off the inside hot. And that, that does actually happen surprisingly more often than you think when you're talking about shell impacts of this size. And so with all of these things potentially causing minor issues that could build up into major issues when the armor takes a hit, the purpose of the teak backing is in large part to catch those small fragments, and thus, whilst an inch or two of teak is going to mean next to nothing when a heavy armor piercing shell comes ploughing through, if it comes ploughing through, for any armor piercing shell that doesn't make it all the way through, the teak backing makes it far less likely that there'll be as much or any incidental shrapnel bursting into the interior of the ship. So that helps as well. So those are the main reasons, and because those reasons fundamentally remain the same, as I say, they don't really ever go away. There are battleships being built and designed both for service in and sea service in World War II in the mid to late 1930s that still include teak backing for their armour. Nicholas Ressar asks, given the US Navy's tendency to mount a 5-inch 38 to anything afloat, is there a record of how many guns were produced? Was there an assembly line set up somewhere? So the answer is yes, there were a number of production lines, and yes, there are records of how many were produced. The number is ballparked at just over 8,000 if you check the NavWeb's website, which I have no reason to doubt them on this claim. But I'll read you the most of the paragraph so you know why there's not a precise figure cited. So it says over 8,000 of these weapons were produced between 1934 and 45, broken down as 2,168 guns in single mountings and 2,714 guns in twin mountings for warships, plus 3,298 guns in single mountings for auxiliary ships and merchant vessels. These figures may not include guns produced prior to the 1st of July 1940, at which point there were 315 single dual-purpose, 8 twin dual-purpose, and 52 twin single-purpose mountings in the entire US fleet. So it's a bit over 8,000, and then give or take that sort of few hundred additional guns that may or may not be included in those figures. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for watching. Just a couple of notes to say. Firstly, something I wasn't able to put in last week's Drydock because it had already been rendered, but for those of you who saw the Task Force 34 at Samar video, I must note once more that the static renders that were done that showed the Japanese and US fleets both in full formation and, the individual types, those were very kindly produced by Drydock Dreams Games. I, unfortunately, due to a slight communications error, ended up putting the video up before they realised what I'd done, so apologies to them, but please do go and check them out. There's links in the video description for that video, as well as obviously thanks again to the various World of Warships clans, again, mentioned in the video description, who helped to conduct the live action element of that particular battle, showing the gunfire and how the tactics generally would have worked out. So there's that. That needs to be said. And also, with regards to the US trip, I am beginning to firm up a potential set of dates and locations to go and visit. So that will hopefully be in late September. As I mentioned before, I do want to, if I'm going to be able to make the bookings before mid-July at the latest, to avoid the prices ramping up massively. But the one spanner in the works at the moment isn't so much the UK side of travel restrictions, because with the new revised travel restrictions, it will be reasonable and possible to make the trip there and coming back from the UK side of things. The main problem at the moment is that there's currently a ban in place on non-US citizens flying from the UK to the US, or flying to the US period, if they've been anywhere in the UK in the 14 days prior to when they arrive in the US. That was put in place at the beginning of this year, which means it's currently illegal for me to go to the US unless I were to do something like fly to Canada or something like that, assuming, of course, I haven't looked into that in particular detail because it's a bit of a pointless exercise. But if I were to fly to Canada for 14 days, then I would theoretically be able to cross the border into the US. But whilst there are some places in Canada that I want to visit, like Haida, etc., there is, of course, the issue of time and expense, because if I'm going to spend 2 weeks in Canada, that's going to cost a fair bit of money. And whilst I'd be able to research and write the scripts for videos to a limited degree, I won't have access to my library, but I can certainly do a lot of the basic framework, and I can use digital sources, including scanned and books, etc. But it will affect my ability to produce videos, because obviously my recording equipment is here in the UK. The main computer with all the rendering software is here in the UK. And then if I'm going to be doing 2 or 3 weeks in America, that basically would mean that I would have to create about a month and a half's worth of content well ahead of time, as well as, paying for 5 to 6 weeks of being overseas, which it basically is not practical. So on those grounds, I'm basically going to have to hope that at some point between now and mid-July, so we've got a couple of months, the US will decide that actually at least some people from the UK can be let into the US without having to, quarantine in place for 2 weeks, which would be make it about as pointless as to try. So we'll see how that goes. See what if they allow it at all, and if they do, what kind of measures you have to take. Because if they say, oh, you have to quarantine at home for 14 days before you fly, well, that's not a massive problem, to be perfectly honest. And I'll have I've got all my paperwork in place other than that. But we'll have to see how that develops. So for those of you in the States, if you happen to hear anything about that from the US side of things in terms of them relaxing the travel ban for people coming from the UK, do let me know. I'd be most grateful to hear it, as and when it happens, obviously. And on that cheery note, I will bid you adieu, and I hope to see you again in another video.